Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to cover test-driven development and specifically how we can use that to create APIs in Node.js. We're going to be using the Express framework, and we'll also be using Jest as our test runner. Now, it doesn't really matter what framework you're using. The important thing to take away from this video is the principles behind test-driven development. In theory, if you understand what I'm doing here, you should be able to take the same ideas and move it over to whatever framework you're using. So for example, maybe you're using Nest.js as another thing I've been doing in my recent content. You should be able to take the stuff you learned from this and move it over to a Nest.js app or whatever other framework you're using. So we'll just jump right in. Like I said, we're going to be using ExpressJS. And specifically, I'm going to be using the Express generator. It's a great way to create, a basic boilerplate Express application. And I've already done this. I ran the Express generator in my desktop. As you can see, I have an API TDD folder here, which I'm going to open up in VS Code. And the way I generated this was I just ran npx express generator --no view and then the name of my project. If we take a look at what's generated, there's not really much here. Just got your basic Express app. It's got your typical Express middlewares like body parser and such, cookie parser. Nothing really special about it. And then you got some initial routes. We've got an index route and a user's route, which just responds with a string. So it's not really quite real yet, but there's enough there for us to kind of get started with. All right, so first thing I want to do is npm install, because we got some dependencies in here. After you do that, I also want to start installing my my dev dependencies, which in this case is our test runner Jest. So npm install -d Jest, and then we also want to install supertest, which is going to be our framework that we're going to use to test APIs specifically. All right, once that finished installing, you should see that it got added as dev dependencies. And then we should be able to add a new test script here, which simply runs Jest. And then I'm going to add the --watch all flag here so that anytime my code changes, it's going to rerun the test for me. And that's something that's really important when you're doing TDD, because you want to be able to have your tests running side by side with the code as you develop and implement it. So in the terminal, just to test this out, I'm going to run npm test. And we can see that Jest is running here, and it didn't find any tests because we didn't write anything yet. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new app.test.js file. And I'm going to just add a basic test here just to make sure that our setup is running properly, right? So I have an empty test here. It's not asserting anything, and we see a passing test. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to include our dependencies. So we just installed supertest. So we're going to import that as request. All right, and then we also need to import our application. So real quick explanation of how to do TDD or test-driven development. The basic idea is that you first write your tests and they would be failing. And then step 2 would be to start implementing until your tests start passing. And then step 3 is to refactor, improve the code, and then maybe even write more tests from that. And then you kind of just go in that circle until eventually you end up with a fully implemented application. You got all your stuff is working, and then at the same time your tests are already there. So the end result is a working piece of software, and B, something that's already well covered with tests. So it really is that simple. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. Like I said, we're using supertest. If you haven't used supertest before, I highly recommend going on their GitHub README. It pretty much details most of what you need to know. But the basic idea with that is you're able to pull in your Express application, and then you can sort of simulate calls with it as if, you know, an API consumer or a user is making calls to your API. And in addition to that, you can start adding assertions to it. So for example, you can assert that, you know, the content type is JSON. You can assert the status code. You can assert the response body, and so on. So let's jump right in. First, let's talk about what we're trying to build, right? So imagine that you're trying to create an API for a to-do list application. So that should be pretty easy to imagine, right? You want to be able to have an API that returns your to-do items. You want to be able to create a new to-do. You know, basic CRUD, you should be able to create, read, update, delete. In this tutorial, we'll just do a subset of that CRUD. So we want to be able to get to-dos and get specific to-dos. And then we also want to be able to create to-dos. So let's go ahead and start writing tests for that. So what I'm actually first going to do here is I'm going to create a describe block. This is actually optional, but it's a good way to group your tests because your application is going to have multiple things in it, right? So in this case, I want to group the tests specific to my to-do stuff that I'm going to wrap in this describe block. All right, so I'm going to move this in here. So maybe I'll call this to-dos API. And you'll notice in the terminal, it kind of groups it by the describe and then the individual tests. Let's first start thinking about how we want our API to behave. So we talked about that. Perhaps we want to be able to do a /todos, and that returns an array of to-dos, right? Pretty basic. We probably also want to be able to get a to-do by ID. So this should return a specific to-do by ID. We said that we want to be able to create to-dos. So this creates it should return a newly created to-do. What else can we do here? With creating stuff, you probably want to do some validation, right? Let's say that it validates the request body, and we'll improve this in a little bit. I'm just kind of laying out what are the tests that I want to do for my API. And remember, right, we didn't implement the API yet. We first want to design it in our head and then write the test for it. It does mean that you need to have some basic fundamentals when it comes to writing APIs, right? So you ideally should already know what HTTP verbs you're supposed to use. You know, so for example, typically you would use a post for creating. You would maybe use a put or a patch for updating. You would use a delete for deleting, and so on. So it's important to have that initial fundamentals, as well as how would you typically write your API endpoints. So that's probably the only real thing you need to have, or you need to understand up front. Another thing that I want to actually add over here is doing /ID returns a 404 if we didn't find it, right? So that's a pretty typical scenario in any API that does get by ID. 404 if not found. All right, so that's a pretty good set of initial tests. You absolutely, if you're following along, you can probably do the rest of the CRUD as an example for you to practice on. So maybe do some tests for updating and deleting. All right, so let's start implementing these tests. And remember, what we want to do is actually write tests that fail because we didn't implement them yet. So with supertest, you can sort of simulate, I think of it as like a fake request by doing it like this. So we're going to do return request. We're going to pass in our application in there. And then from here, you specify what HTTP method you want to run. In this case, we're going to do a get on /todos.
And let's think about what are some of the stuff that we want to assert here. First of all, I want to expect that the content type is JSON, and we want to be able to assert the status is 200. So we can do expect 200. And then let's do some assertions on the response itself. So let's say that our array of to-dos will have a name property and a Boolean property for whether or not it's completed. So let's do then here. So you'll notice that we're effectively working with promises. And within this then callback is where we can start writing some assertions on the response itself. So for example, with Jest, one of the nice things you can do is create assertions like this. We can assert that the response body equals something, right? We can say like it should equal an array, but to kind of make this a little bit more useful, let's say that we want to expect a array containing, and within that array we expect that to be some sort of object, like we said, which has this shape, has a name, and we want that to be a string, and a completed, which we want that to be any Boolean. Again, this basically just says when I call /reduce with HTTP GET, I should get back some kind of array that contains any number of objects with this shape. It has a name, which is a string, and completed as a Boolean. All right, so I think that's it for this test. I'm just gonna go ahead and copy some of this because some of this logic is reusable in this next test. So we want to be able to do /to_do/id and get back a object, right? So it's basically sort of like a subset of this request. If, for example, we did /to_do/1, we still want to expect JSON content type. We still want it to be a status 200. But in this case, we just want to get back the specific object that has that ID. So we're going to remove this array containing wrapper, and we're just going to do expect to get back an object that has those properties. It has that schema. All right, so that's pretty basic. Let's do what's next. We said that we want a 404 if it's not found. So in this one, we can just do return request, kind of similar thing. We want to do a get /todos/SomeID. So in this case, we want to provide an ID that is going to result in a 404. Let's just say that something with a crazy 999 value like that is going to result in a 404, and we can do expect 404. We're just going to keep it simple like that. You can also assert the response body if you want, but the default Express application that we have here from Express Generator just has a pretty basic built-in error handler, which returns an HTML page. So we're just going to keep it simple. We're just going to assert the status itself. You can improve this later if you implement a new error handler in your Express app. All right, next we want to be able to do a post to create a new to-do. So we're going to do return request app.post, and we're going to do to-dos, right? So in this case, we're still using /todos, but we changed to specifically the HTTP post verb. So one thing that's different here is we can do a send, which accepts an object, which is effectively going to be your request body. So in this case, we probably want to ask for a name for the new to-do. Maybe it's, let's say do dishes, all right? And we still expect it to return some form of JSON, but typically with creating resources, you want to respond with
a status of 201, right? 201 created. And typically when you do a create request, APIs would typically return the newly created entity. So we can maybe copy this then block, except that we're going to make it more specific, right? So in this case, we want to be able to expect that the name specifically matches this name, right? So it's not just any string anymore. And specifically, we want to say that initially this should be false. Now, finally, we want to do some validation later on. So in this case, we want to be able to assert that if, let's say that if you gave a number for the name, it's going to return a status for 422 or maybe 400, whichever one you like. So let's do return request, again, app. We're still going to do a post on /todos, and we're still going to do a send, but in this case, we're going to send a value that our server does not like. So let's do maybe just 123, and we expect this to, error out with maybe a status 422. So there it is. We have our tests, and we're gonna go ahead and start implementing this. One thing to really call out real quick is ideally all of your tests is initially failing. We do notice that our tests for the 404 is already passing, and that's because we actually never implemented the route for to-dos, so it's automatically giving back a 404. So that's kind of a false positive in this case, but you'll see as we implement this, you'll eventually see that this will fail, and then we're going to make it pass again. All right, so we've got our tests written. Now we get into implementing the code itself, right? So we've got our app.js. First of all, we don't have any routing for to-dos, so that's what we're going to do first. Within the routes folder, I'm going to create a new file, todos.js, and I'm just going to copy this initial structure that we have in our example users router, just for the sake of time. And we're going to start implementing our routes. But actually, before I do that, we also need to register this router into our application itself. So maybe I will just replace this users router with the to-dos router. Let's rename this to to-dos router. And you see it got updated here, and we'll update this to /todos. All right, now we can go back to our to-dos router and start implementing. So since this is just a basic tutorial, I'm just going to create an array of to-dos. You can imagine that in a more realistic example, this is probably going to be pulling from a database. But in our case, we'll keep it simple. We're just going to have an array, an in-memory array of to-dos. So this might have an ID, let's say 1, and we said that there's going to be a name property and a completed property. All right, so in our case, we just have one item, one to-do item. All right, so let's start implementing. So our slash here is really representing /todos, right? It's effectively that, because remember in our app.js, we're sort of registering this router under the /todos path. So really everything that gets defined here, every route that gets defined here has this /todos prefix, if you think about it that way. So if you take a look at the logs on our failing test, right, it says that get /todos is meant to return an array of to-dos. Right now it's failing on the content type because we're simply returning a string. So we can change this to JSON. So that part, it makes that step pass, but then it says that you're supposed to return an object that looks like this. You're returning a string. So if we return to-dos here, all of a sudden our first test passes. And actually we should probably add in our tests that this has an ID property, which is a number. All right, so still passing. Next, let's try to get our second test here to pass. We're gonna do router.get. So we're saying that this is by ID. If you know Express well, you know that you can specify URL parameters like this, and that's gonna be in our request object. So as I have this typed out, notice that our 404 test is now failing as we expected to, because it's now an existing route, so it's not 404ing because of that. It's failing because we never returned a 404 response within this route handler. But we're not quite there yet. Let's first work on, again, this second test. We want to be able to return a specific to-do by ID. So this should be pretty simple. You should be able to do to-dos.find, and we're just gonna do for each to-do, if the to-do ID equals request.params.id, and we should probably translate this to, should cast this to a number because that's probably a string. All right, so this should return the to-do with the matching ID that you passed in through the URL. So maybe let's change this to found to-do, and we're simply just gonna do rest.json the to-do that was found. If you were doing this for real, right, you would probably do some kind of database query here to find your to-do in a database. All right, so notice that our second test is now passing. Now let's get back to the 404. What if the to-do that we're looking for is not in there? So we want to add some logic here of, if we did not find to-do, we want to return a 404 here. What I'm actually going to add here is there's this library called HTTP errors that I think is pretty useful in Express apps, so we're going to install that. HTTP errors. All right, now that that's installed, I am going to import it as create error equals require HTTP errors. And again, if you know Express well, you probably know that you typically would just kind of forward the error down the application, and you do that with the next function here. So usually you would do something like next, and then you pass in your error object here, and then something else down the line in your application, if you have your own custom error and handler, for example, is going to catch that, and then it's going to respond accordingly. Express, like I said, does have its own sort of built-in basic error handler, so we're just going to utilize that. I don't really think it's worth creating a custom one for this tutorial, but in this case, we're gonna do next create error, and we want to say not found, and I should probably return there, and all of a sudden our third test is passing, right? So looks pretty good to me. And then our last test, well, second to last test here, is doing a post. So how do we create to-dos? So we're gonna do a router.post on /todos. Let's write our inline function route handler. And what does this do? First of all, you should know that the request body lives in request.body. So you can do something like this. And then imagine that we're trying to just take that request and add it to our list of to-dos. So we probably want to create, first of all, we have to create our new to-do object, and we should probably give that an ID. We're just gonna do we're gonna try and simulate an auto incrementing ID. We're just gonna add 1 to the length, and the name is gonna come from the body itself. and then we're gonna initialize completed to false, right? Because we assume that you're adding a new to-do, it's not completed yet. Then we should probably update our array. So we're gonna do a to-dos.push new to-do, and then finally we want to again respond with JSON, and we're gonna simply return our new to-do. Actually, I made a typo here, guys. This should just be slash, right? Remember, because we're starting from slash to-dos as a prefix, I shouldn't have typed slash to-dos over there. And now that we have that fixed, we're almost there. The only thing that's kind of missing is that it's expecting us to use a status 201 from the test. So I'm just gonna add status 201. And finally, our second to last test is passing. Now we've got one more test, and I actually need to refactor this because I made another mistake here. This should also be post to-dos. I'm gonna fix that real quick. In our last test, this should be post. And back into the code, we said that we wanna do some validation. For example, if we pass in a number, we expect it to kind of error out and say that, you know, we want to return a status 422. So kind of similar strategy with what we did here is we can do something, we can add a basic validator here. Like maybe we can do if the type of body.name does not equal string, simply return a create error of status 422. Let's just say validation error. Our tests are passing, right? So we've got a completely working API. The tests are passing, and from here, it's up to you where you want to go. You know, at this point, you can further enhance your code. You can refactor. You can add more tests for whatever other features you're trying to support in your API, right? So, like for example, what are some things we can clean up here? You know, some people like to move these inline route handlers into a dedicated controller file, and then you can also unit test those individual controller methods, because technically the test we're doing here is really an integration test, right? So you can further enhance this by doing some unit tests, you know, just unit testing these individual functions. What else can you do? You know, you can bring in a more sophisticated validator. So maybe you want to use Joy or something similar where you can do schema validation. And the big idea is, right, our test is not necessarily testing the implementation details. If I were to introduce Joy here to do my validation check, it should still ultimately satisfy what we're trying to do here, where if the validation fails, we do a 422. So this doesn't care about the specific implementation detail. That's kind of up for you to decide. Similarly, maybe you were doing this in a real application. You know, you likely won't have an array of in-memory to-dos like this. So you could incorporate a database, maybe an in-memory database, or you could have a mock database. It's really up to you, right? And again, you kind of just go in that circle of write tests, implement, get it to pass, refactor, write more tests, implement, refactor, and so on. And by the way, just for sanity's sake, right, let's go into let's test our application. Let's run this. I'm gonna do npm start my application, and then I'm gonna go to Insomnia and create a new request here. We know that this is running on localhost 3000. Let's just do a send here to see there's our application, and then when we go to /todos, we get back our array of to-dos. Let's go ahead and do /1, and that gets back just the one to-do item. Let's try the 404, right? So if I put in a non-existing ID here, it's gonna
status 404 not found. Next, let's test our post. We said that we want a JSON with a name, right? If we do dishes, I send that. It adds the do dishes, and to check our validation logic, I'll pass in some numbers here and send. We get status 422, right? So that's one of the benefits with test-driven development, right? Is I was able to effectively implement my code, and I never really once had to go in to Insomnia or Postman to manually test it. I'm effectively validating that my application is working by getting my tests to pass. So that's where test-driven development is really nice, right? You end up with a fully working product, a fully tested product, and then you can kind of just keep refactoring and improving it. But yeah, there's the basics of test-driven development with APIs. And like I said, the important takeaway here is the principles, right? Not necessarily the specific testing framework or test runner, right? If you're using Mocha instead of Jest, and if you were maybe using NestJS instead of Express, a lot of the fundamentals here still applies there. You might just need to change a little bit of stuff. So for example, you can actually also use supertest in a Nest.js application, right? So a lot of the stuff we did here, if you were using Nest as your node framework, then you can still move a lot of these ideas over in that space. All right, so that's it for today, guys. Really quick video. Hope you enjoyed that one. Definitely TDD is something that I know I'm personally still trying to get better at, but you know, if you know the basics of doing it like this and you have these base fundamentals, it's a good thing to have in your toolbox. All right, with that said, hope you have a great day, and let me know in the comments if you have any feedback, questions, recommendations. You got any content you want me to cover in the future, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.